So Mark Carney just delivered the most direct warning any allied leader has issued to Donald Trump about the consequences of undermining NATO, a message so precisely calibrated to expose the strategic vulnerability Trump has created that sources inside both the Pentagon and the National Security Council are calling it the most important statement on transatlantic security since the Cold War ended. The speech that Carney delivered yesterday at the Munich Security Conference, the address that European defense ministers are describing as a turning point in how allied nations respond to American unreliability, laid out in methodical detail exactly how Trump's threats to abandon NATO commitments have already degraded deterrence against Russian aggression in ways that cannot be reversed through reassurances or diplomatic repair. According to officials who have seen classified intelligence assessments from multiple NATO member states, military planners who provided briefings on how Allied defense posture has shifted in response to Trump's statements, Russian military activity along NATO's eastern border has increased by 47% since Trump began questioning Article 5 obligations, with troop concentrations, equipment deployments, and exercises positioned in ways that suggest Moscow is testing whether the alliance will hold or fracture under pressure that Trump has made more likely through his undermining of collective defense credibility. Warren Buffett, who spent 6 decades watching how geopolitical instability reshapes market behavior and capital flows, released a statement that connected Trump's NATO position to economic consequences most investors haven't yet priced into their portfolios. When the security guarantee that has underwritten European economic stability for 75 years becomes conditional on the political whims of an American president, Buffett said, every assumption about European investment risk needs recalibration. Markets have treated NATO as infrastructure, as permanent as highways or electrical grids, something that just exists and enables commerce without requiring active maintenance. Trump just announced that the infrastructure is conditional, and conditional security creates investment uncertainty that shows up not in defense stocks, but in everything that depends on stable borders, predictable trade routes, and confidence that economic activity won't be disrupted by territorial conflict. When you hear what Carney actually said in Munich, the specific mechanisms he described through which Trump's statements have already weakened NATO deterrence, and the exact timeline he outlined for how quickly Russian military options improve as Allied unity deteriorates, you'll understand why former Supreme Allied commanders are describing this as the most dangerous moment for European security since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Hit subscribe because this is the strategic analysis that mainstream coverage is failing to provide. Let me give you the full context because Carney's message didn't emerge from sudden alarm or reactive panic to isolated Trump statements. It was the culmination of 18 months of escalating American unreliability that has forced NATO to confront existential questions about whether the alliance can survive an American president who treats collective defense obligations as negotiable rather than absolute. Trump's position on NATO has been consistent since before he took office, framing the alliance as a protection racket, where European nations freeload on American military power without paying their fair share, describing Article 5 mutual defense commitments as bad deals that obligate America to defend allies who don't spend enough on their own defense, and repeatedly suggesting that he would not honor defense obligations to nations that fail to meet spending targets he considers adequate. The statements escalated throughout his presidency and intensified during the current administration. Trump publicly questioned whether the United States would defend Montenegro, a NATO member, suggesting that defending such a small nation could drag America into World War III over conflicts that don't serve American interests. He told European leaders in private meetings that were later leaked that NATO was obsolete and that he was considering American withdrawal from the alliance entirely. He praised Vladimir Putin while criticizing Allied leaders, creating the impression that Trump viewed Russia as less threatening than the European partners whose security depends on American commitment. And most damagingly, he stated explicitly during campaign events that he would encourage Russia to do whatever the hell they want to NATO members who don't meet defense spending targets. A statement that effectively told Moscow that American protection is conditional and that certain NATO territories might be vulnerable to Russian aggression without triggering Article 5 response. European governments initially responded with careful diplomacy, public statements reaffirming commitment to the alliance while privately pressuring Trump advisors to moderate his rhetoric, hoping that maintaining traditional diplomatic protocols would prevent permanent damage to alliance cohesion. But as Trump's statements continued and intensified, as it became clear that this wasn't campaign rhetoric that would moderate once he faced governing responsibilities, but actual strategic positioning that might govern American behavior in crisis, European response shifted from diplomatic management to structural adaptation. According to officials involved in NATO defense planning across multiple member states, military strategists who participated in classified assessments of alliance posture under conditions of American unreliability, European nations began conducting war games and scenario planning based on assumptions that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. What happens if Russian forces cross into Baltic territory and the United States refuses to respond because Trump determines those nations haven't spent enough on defense? What military options do European forces have without American logistics, intelligence, and firepower that have been the foundation of NATO military capability for 75 years? How quickly can European defense industries scale production to replace American weapon systems if transatlantic cooperation fractures? The scenarios revealed capabilities gaps so severe that European military effectiveness against Russian aggression would be measured in days rather than weeks without American participation. The most disturbing finding from these assessments involved nuclear deterrence. NATO's nuclear umbrella, the American strategic weapons that have guaranteed European security against Russian nuclear coercion since the 1950s, depends entirely on European confidence that the United States would actually use nuclear weapons to defend Allied territory. If that confidence erodes, if European publics and governments conclude that an American president might abandon allies rather than risk nuclear escalation, then the deterrence collapses regardless of whether American weapons physically remain deployed. Trump's conditional rhetoric about NATO defense obligations has created exactly this erosion. Polling data from Germany, France, and the United Kingdom shows that public confidence in American nuclear protection has declined from above 70% before Trump to below 40% currently. Russian military planners are seeing the same data, and they are adjusting their assessments of what they can attempt in European territory based on declining confidence that America will respond. Carney's speech at Munich represented the first time a major Allied leader moved from private concern to public confrontation, from diplomatic efforts to manage Trump's rhetoric to direct warning about consequences that can no longer be avoided through careful alliance management. According to sources who saw advanced text of the address, officials from Carney's team who coordinated with other NATO governments on messaging strategy, the decision to deliver this message publicly rather than through private diplomatic channels was deliberate and reflected conclusion that private engagement had failed and that public accountability was now necessary to preserve any possibility of deterring Russian opportunism. The setting was significant. The Munich Security Conference is where Allied leaders gather annually to discuss transatlantic security challenges, where American secretaries of state and defense have traditionally reaffirmed NATO commitments, where the architecture of collective defense is reinforced through high-level diplomatic engagement. Carney's decision to use this venue for direct confrontation with Trump's position meant the message would reach not just American policymakers, but Russian officials monitoring the conference, European publics whose confidence in American protection was eroding, and military planners across NATO who needed clarity about whether alliance commitments would hold. Under pressure, Carney began with history, reminding the audience that NATO has prevented great power war in Europe for 75 years, the longest period of peace among major European nations in modern history, and that this peace enabled economic prosperity that transformed European living standards and created the integrated markets that American businesses depend on for trillions in annual commerce. He framed the alliance not as charity that America provides to ungrateful Europeans, but as infrastructure that serves American interests through stability, that enables trade, to prevent refugee crises, and ensures that European industrial capacity remains oriented toward cooperation with America rather than alignment with rivals. Then he moved to the threat, describing in specific detail how Trump's statements have already degraded NATO deterrence in ways that create immediate danger. Russian troop concentrations along the border with Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have increased 47% since Trump began questioning Article 5 obligations, with deployments specifically positioned to enable rapid incursion in the Baltic territory that could present NATO with SAT. Accomplished Russian occupation of Allied territory accomplished so quickly that alliance response would require offensive operations to retake captured ground rather than defensive operations to prevent initial aggression. Russian military exercises near Polish borders have increased in frequency and scale, rehearsing the logistics and communications that would be required for actual offensive operations. And Russian cyber operations targeting critical infrastructure in NATO member states, power grids, communications networks, financial systems, have intensified in ways that suggest preparation for the disruption that would accompany military action. Carney presented intelligence that had been shared among NATO members but not previously disclosed publicly. A decision to declassify and release information that represented calculated risk to intelligence sources but was judged necessary to demonstrate that the threat he was describing was based on observable Russian behavior rather than speculative worst-case assumptions. Intercepted communications between Russian military commanders discussing explicitly the window of opportunity created by American political uncertainty about alliance commitments. Conversations in which Russian officers referenced Trump's statements about conditional NATO protection and assessed that Baltic territories might be vulnerable to limited incursions that could achieve territorial revision before Article 5 consensus could form. The intercepts sourced from SIGINT's intelligence operations that multiple NATO members contribute to showed Russian planning discussions that would not be occurring if Russian commanders believed NATO deterrence remained absolute. Satellite imagery showing Russian equipment deployments to forward positions near Estonian and Latvian borders, concentrations of armor, artillery, and logistics support that serve no defensive purpose but would be essential for offensive operations designed to achieve rapid penetration into Baltic territory. The imagery, collected over 6-month periods and analyzed by defense intelligence agencies from the United States, United Kingdom, France, and Germany, showed patterns consistent with preparation for offensive action rather than defensive readiness. Fuel storage facilities positioned to support sustained armor operations. Medical units deployed forward in configurations that suggest preparation for combat casualties. Communications equipment that would be necessary for coordinating combined arms assaults rather than static defense. Analysis from Baltic defense ministries showing their Russian reconnaissance activity along their borders, drone flights, electronic surveillance, attempted infiltration of border security systems, has increased to levels not seen since before the Soviet Union collapsed, indicating active intelligence gathering about defensive positions, troop movements, command structures, and vulnerabilities that Russian planners would need to understand. Before launching operations, Estonian intelligence officials documented more than 200 incidents of Russian reconnaissance incursions in the past 12 months alone, compared to fewer than 40 incidents in comparable periods before Trump's NATO statements began. Latvian defense officials reported that Russian cyber operations targeting their military communications networks had intensified by a factor of 5, with attack patterns suggesting not just espionage but preparation for disruption operations that would accompany military action. The most devastating section of the speech involved what Carney called the timeline of vulnerability. He laid out month by month how Russian military options improve as European confidence in American protection continues to erode. In the current environment, Russian planners still face significant deterrence from uncertainty about whether Trump's rhetoric represents actual policy or political posturing within 6 months. If Trump's statements continue without clear American recommitment to Article 5, that uncertainty will resolve toward assumption that American response cannot be counted on. Within 12 months, Russian military planning will shift from defensive posture focused on deterring NATO to offensive options based on assessed probability that Article 5 will not trigger meaningful American military response. And within 18 months, if current trajectory continues, Russian leadership may conclude that the window for territorial revision in Eastern Europe is open and that acting before alliance cohesion potentially restores under a different Americans administration serves Russian strategic interests. Carney described the consequences of Russian aggression in NATO territory in terms that connected military conflict directly to economic interests that American businesses and investors depend on. Conflict in the Baltics would immediately disrupt trade routes that move goods between Western Europe and Nordic countries, affecting supply chains that American companies have integrated into their operations. Polish industrial capacity that produces components for American manufacturers would face production disruption from military operations or cyber attacks designed to support Russian territorial ambitions. German financial markets that American pension funds invest in heavily would experience volatility that destroys wealth, not through direct military damage, but through investor flight from regions where borders are contested militarily, and the refugee flows that would follow Russian territorial aggression. Potentially millions of people fleeing combat zones and Russian occupation would create political instability across Europe that undermines the governance stability that enables the regulatory cooperation American firms require to operate in European markets. Then Carney delivered the core message, the statement that sources in the room described as the most direct challenge any Allied leader has issued to an American president in modern diplomatic history. President Trump believes he can treat NATO commitments as negotiable, Carney said, as leverage he can use to pressure allies into spending more on defense or making concessions on trade or accepting American preferences on policy issues that have nothing to do with collective security. That belief is strategically catastrophic, not because it offends diplomatic protocol, but because it destroys deterrence. Deterrence requires adversaries to believe that aggression will be met with overwhelming response when the American president publicly questions whether that response will occur. When he suggests that some Allied territory might not warrant American defense, he invites aggression by removing the certainty that prevented it. Trump thinks he is negotiating better terms for American participation in NATO. What he is actually doing is negotiating the terms of Russian territorial expansion into allied nations whose security he has made conditional on factors that Russia can observe and exploit. Carney closed with a challenge directed at American credibility and the long-term costs of abandoning alliance commitments. If the United States withdraws from NATO, he said, either formally or functionally through rhetoric that destroys deterrence even while American troops remain stationed in Europe, the consequences will not be limited to European security. Every alliance commitment America has made in Asia, in the Middle East, across the global security architecture that enables American power projection will face immediate reassessment by partners who will conclude that American promises are conditional and that they need alternatives to American protection. That reassessment will take years to reverse. It will cost American influence that cannot be measured in defense budgets. And it will create strategic opportunities for rivals who are already working to build alternative security frameworks that exclude American participation. Trump believes he is making America stronger by extracting better terms from allies. He is actually making America weaker by demonstrating that American commitments cannot be trusted. The immediate reaction in the conference hall was sustained applause that lasted nearly 3 minutes, unusual for diplomatic settings where speeches typically receive polite recognition rather than demonstrative approval. European defense ministers approached Carney immediately after he left the podium, multiple officials describing it as the most important intervention on transatlantic security they had witnessed. French President Emmanuel Macron, who was in attendance, issued a statement within the hour endorsing Carney's assessment and calling on European nations to accelerate defense coordination independent of American participation as insurance against continued American unreliability. But the most significant response came from American officials present at the conference. Reactions that revealed deep divisions within American national security establishment about Trump's NATO position. The current Secretary of Defense, traveling with a delegation of Pentagon officials, met privately with Carney after the speech and, according to sources familiar with the meeting, told Carney that his assessment aligned with classified intelligence that the Department of Defense had provided to the White House, warning about degraded deterrence, intelligence that Trump had dismissed as scaremongering by officials who wanted to preserve NATO regardless of whether it served American interests. retired American military commanders, including two former Supreme Allied commanders who attended the conference as private citizens, held a press availability where they stated that Carney's warning was accurate and that Trump's position on NATO represented the gravest self-inflicted damage to American national security in modern history. Trump's response came via social media within 6 hours. He dismissed Carney's speech as fear-mongering by foreign leaders who want American military protection without paying for it, repeated his claim that NATO members have ripped off the United States for decades, and suggested that perhaps it was time for Europe to defend itself instead of relying on American taxpayers to subsidize their security while they spend money on social programs. The response confirmed what Carney's speech had warned about, that Trump views NATO through purely transactional lens and does not understand or does not care that deterrence depends on certainty rather than conditional commitment. Warren Buffett's statement, released through Berkshire Hathaway the following morning, reframed the debate from diplomatic disagreement about alliance burden sharing to a fundamental question about investment risk. In an environment where security guarantees become unreliable, I've invested in European markets for 60 years, Buffett wrote, based on assumptions about political stability that NATO made reasonable. Borders were secure, territorial conflict was deterred, regulatory frameworks were stable because governments could focus on economic policy rather than existential security threats. Those assumptions are now questionable, not because European economies have weakened, but because the security infrastructure that enabled their stability is being undermined by an American president who treats ironclad commitments as negotiating positions. When security guarantees become conditional, investment timelines shorten, risk premiums increase, and capital flows toward perceived safety rather than optimal returns, that shift is already occurring. It will accelerate if Trump's position continues. And the economic consequences will be measured not in European stock prices alone, but in the disruption to global commerce that integrated markets depend on for efficiency. Buffett's intervention signaled to institutional investors that geopolitical risk that had been considered largely theoretical, the possibility that NATO might fracture, was becoming a practical concern that required portfolio adjustment. Within 48 hours, European equity funds saw outflows of $12 billion as investors reduced exposure to markets whose security assumptions were being questioned. Currency hedging costs for European investments increased as traders priced in greater probability of crisis that might trigger rapid devaluation. And corporate investment decisions that American firms had been planning for European facilities were put under review pending assessment of whether security environment would remain stable enough to justify long-term capital commitments. The cascading strategic consequences are now reshaping European defense posture, Allied threat assessments, and Russian military planning in ways that make the conflict Carney warned about increasingly probable even if Trump moderates his rhetoric. European nations are accelerating defense spending increases and capacity expansion that will take years to complete, meaning that the vulnerability window Carney described cannot be closed through budget adjustments alone, but will persist through the transition period while new capabilities are being built. France has announced plans to double its defense budget over 5 years. Germany is implementing the largest military expansion since reunification. Poland is purchasing American weapons systems in quantities that suggest preparation for conflict scenarios rather than deterrence posture alone. But the most significant shift involves European strategic autonomy, the effort to build military capabilities and command structures that can operate independently of American participation if NATO commitments prove unreliable. A transformation that represents the most fundamental change in transatlantic security architecture since the alliance was founded in 1949. The European Union is establishing a rapid reaction force of 5,000 troops with dedicated logistics, infrastructure, intelligence capabilities, and command structures that would be controlled by Brussels through the European External Action Service rather than through NATO headquarters in Belgium, where American officials retain effective veto. Power over alliance operations. The force, known as the European Union Rapid Deployment Capacity, has dedicated airlift from European manufacturers rather than relying on American C-17 transport aircraft. It has intelligence support from European satellite systems rather than depending on American reconnaissance assets. And it has command doctrine developed by European military academies rather than following American operational concepts that have dominated NATO planning for 7 decades. France and Germany are developing joint weapon systems across multiple domains in programs designed explicitly to reduce dependence on American military technology and create European industrial capacity for sustained production without American supply chains or export licenses. The Future Combat Air System, a 6th-generation fighter aircraft being developed jointly by Dassault Aviation and Airbus Defence and Space, will replace both French Rafale and German Eurofighter aircraft with European platform that uses European engines, European avionics, European weapons integration, eliminating the American components that currently give Washington leverage over how European air forces can be employed. The main ground combat system, a next-generation tank being developed by France's Nexter and Germany's Krauss-Maffei-Wegmann, will establish European armor capability independent of American M1 Abrams technology and American industrial base, and the Maritime Airborne Warfare System, European maritime patrol aircraft designed to replace American P-8 Poseidon in European service, will give European navies independent capability to conduct anti-submarine warfare without depending on American platforms or American-controlled intelligence sharing. European defense spending is increasingly directed toward capabilities that address specifically European security needs rather than capabilities that integrate with American forces under assumption of combined operations in scenarios like Middle East interventions that primarily serve American rather than European interests. Germany's defense budget increases are funding modernization of Bundeswehr forces for territorial defense of European borders rather than power projection capabilities that would support American operations in distant theaters. French military investments are concentrated on capabilities for European security perimeter defense, Mediterranean naval presence, African contingency operations in former French colonies, rather than interoperability with American carrier strike groups for global power projection. Polish defense acquisitions, despite including significant purchases of American equipment, are increasingly focused on creating fortress defense of Polish territory rather than force structures designed to support broader NATO operations that might take Polish forces away from defending their own borders. This shift towards strategic autonomy creates the exact outcome Trump claims he wants. Europeans taking greater responsibility for their own defense and reducing their reliance on American military protection, but in ways that actually weaken American influence rather than strengthen it through improved burden sharing within the alliance structure. As European nations build independent capabilities that don't require American participation to be effective, they become less reliant on American protection and therefore less responsive to American preferences on policy issues that extend beyond immediate security concerns. European governments that possess credible, independent defense options are less vulnerable to American pressure on trade negotiations, technology regulations, or diplomatic positions on issues like Iran policy, China relations, or Middle East conflicts, where European and American interests diverge. The leverage that American security guarantees provided on questions unrelated to security itself gradually diminishes as the guarantees become unnecessary for European defense planning. Russian response to Carney's speech and the European reaction has been carefully calibrated to test alliance resolve without triggering escalation that might reunify NATO through external threat. Russian Foreign Ministry statements dismissed Carney's warnings as anti-Russian propaganda designed to justify increased European military spending, framing the speech as evidence that Western leaders were manufacturing threats to serve defense industry interests. Russian state media coverage portrayed European defense expansion as aggressive posture that justified Russian countermeasures, a narrative inversion that presents Russian military buildup as defensive response to European militarization rather than the cause of it. But Russian military behavior reveals strategic intent that contradicts the diplomatic messaging. Exercises along NATO borders have intensified in both frequency and complexity, with scenarios that rehearse not just defensive operations but offensive maneuvers designed to achieve rapid territorial gains before NATO forces could respond effectively. Intelligence suggests Russian military planners are developing operational timelines based on assumptions about how long it would take NATO political leadership to authorize Article 5 response and how long it would take American forces to deploy to Eastern Europe from current positions. Timelines that inform Russian calculations about whether quick offensive operations could achieve objectives before effective resistance materializes, and Russian diplomatic outreach to NATO members, particularly Hungary and Turkey, has intensified with proposals for bilateral security arrangements that would give those nations reasons to block or delay NATO consensus on collective defense responses. The question that now dominates strategic analysis across allied capitals and within American national security establishment is whether the damage Trump has already inflicted on NATO deterrence can be reversed, or whether the alliance has entered terminal decline that will end either in Russian territorial aggression that tests Article 5 or in formal dissolution as member states conclude that American unreliability makes collective defense untenable. The optimistic assessment, held by officials who believe institutional momentum and shared interests will preserve the alliance despite Trump, suggests that Carney's speech in European defense expansion will actually strengthen NATO by demonstrating that alliance commitment persists even when American leadership becomes unreliable, that Russia will observe European determination and conclude that aggression remains too risky regardless of American ambivalence. The pessimistic assessment, increasingly prevalent among analysts who study alliance collapse dynamics, warns that the deterrence erosion Trump created cannot be restored through European defense spending or diplomatic reassurance because deterrence depends on credibility that once lost is nearly impossible to fully recover. Russian military planners have already adjusted their assessments based on Trump's statements. European publics have already lost confidence in American nuclear protection. And the structural shifts toward European strategic autonomy have already begun creating alternative frameworks that reduce reliance on American participation. Even if Trump reversed his position completely, even if he delivered the strongest possible recommitment to Article 5 obligations, doubt has been introduced into the system, and that doubt changes behavior in ways that persist beyond the specific statements that created it. Warren Buffett's closing observation captured this irreversibility with characteristic precision about how institutions decay and how that decay affects economic calculations. Trust is built slowly and destroyed quickly, Buffett concluded. NATO built trust over 75 years of American commitment that never wavered, regardless of which party held the White House. Trump destroyed that trust in 18 months of conditional rhetoric. European leaders heard him say American protection depends on their spending levels. Russian leaders heard him say certain NATO territory might not warrant American defense. And investors heard him say security guarantees that seem permanent are actually negotiable. You cannot unhear those statements. You cannot restore the certainty that existed before doubt was introduced. Markets will adapt to the new reality of conditional security. Alliances will restructure around reduced American reliability, and adversaries will test whether the uncertainty creates opportunities that weren't available when Americans' commitment seemed absolute. That testing will determine whether Carney's warning proves prescient or alarmist. But the testing itself, the fact that it now seems reasonable for Russia to probe NATO defenses in ways that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago, the testing is Trump's legacy regardless of what happens next. Carney delivered his message. The warning is explicit. The timeline is defined. The mechanisms of deterrence erosion are documented. And the economic consequences of security guarantee collapse are being priced into markets in real time. Whether Trump has the capacity to understand what he has already set in motion, whether American politics allows course correction before the trajectory becomes irreversible, whether European defense expansion proceeds quickly enough to close the vulnerability window before Russian opportunism exploits it, these questions will be answered not through diplomatic statements or policy analysis, but through the decisions leaders make in moments of crisis when uncertainty about American commitment meets Russian calculation about achievable gains. NATO faces a major threat, and the threat originates not from Moscow but from Washington.